Wonderful. We're just going to go ahead and dive right in, if that's okay. Mallary, let's start with your illness. When and how did that happen?
Yes. So first, I just want to say thank you for everyone who's here. It's so lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience, including people I interviewed for the book and people I just met tonight. So thank you. So my illness started when I was 12 years old, which is when I developed anorexia nervosa. And I had lost my mother to metastatic breast cancer when I was 11. And she had been sick for 3 years. And during that period, I really held on to hope that she was going to be okay. And my father and I would always talk about how she was a soldier in a battle. She was the little engine that could. She was going to get over the mountain. And even as the cancer metastasized, I still believed that she was going to survive because that was the narrative that my family and I really held on to. And when she didn't, it felt like my whole world had fallen apart and I didn't know what to do. So I decided that I was going to do what I knew how to do best, which was to continue to put on a happy face and pretend that I was okay. And so I wanted to just read an excerpt from the book related to this because one, I want you to just be immersed in the narrative, but also I want to just take you back in time to that immediate aftermath of my mother's death because it really did pave the pathway for me to go on to develop anorexia. So I wrote, 14 hours after my mom died, I walked alone to middle school. A wintry wind numbed my ears and nose. The snow glistened like glitter and ice crackled under my boots. I knew that route well, having walked along it every day in the 6th grade. My father had offered to drive me to school that morning, but I turned him down, secretly wanting everything to stay the same. I pretended to read a Babysitter's Club book as I walked, hoping to find refuge in its pages, but the words blurred through teardrops that fell onto the page. I shielded the tears with my book as I walked into school and toward the bathroom, where I hid in a stall. Erase it from my mind, I told myself, closing my eyes as I shook my head from side to side. Erase it from my mind. The school bell rang. I wiped my eyes dry and told the tears to stay away. I'm okay, everything's fine. I'm okay, everything's fine. I shoved that tear-stained book into my LL Bean backpack, looked in the mirror and smiled, and then I walked off into my new world. Mom would want you to be strong, I kept telling myself. Show her how strong you can be. I sat in class and raised my hand to answer my teacher's questions as I would on any other day. I didn't speak a word about my mother until afternoon recess when I told a friend what had happened. She broke the news to my teacher, Mrs. Fallon, who hadn't yet been notified about my mother's death. She pulled me aside and asked how I was doing. She would later tell me she was heartbroken not only by the news, but also by how composed I seemed. This little girl's mother has just died, she kept thinking. Her mother just died. I'm okay, I told her with a meek smile. Really, I'm fine. I kept telling myself to stay cool, calm, and collected, repeating the same words I had once heard a nurse tell my mother after she had been hospitalized for a platelet transfusion. I thought about my mother throughout the day, fixating on the fact that she'd been alive less than 24 hours earlier. I kept replaying the previous day in my head, wishing I could hit rewind, then pause the moments forever. I would have settled for stagnancy if it meant I could have Mom back in my life. And this idea of settling for stagnancy was something that I really held on to, and I found myself wanting to stop time. And as an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old, I had conjured up this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. That's a very complicated thought for an 11-year-old to have, but at the same time, I was taking a health class where we were being taught about quote unquote good foods and bad foods. And I was beginning to learn that I could change the way my body looked based on what I was eating. So I began to restrict my food intake, not as a way of being skinny, but really as a way of trying to stay small and safe. And so that food restriction was in some ways this warped form of time travel that for a brief time did make me feel closer to my mother, but it ultimately landed me in the hospital and led to a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa when I was 13.
Mallary, your mother obviously is a real presence in the book. Can you give us 90 seconds about your mom? Tell us what she was like.
I've never been asked that question in any of the book events. It's a beautiful question. So my mom, I write just in the first paragraph of the book that she loved bargains, right? She loved going to yard sales and was very frugal because she didn't grow up with very much. And she was someone who loved me dearly. She took me to all of my school outings, took me to grand openings where we would find free food, right? I mean, she loved free food. But she also had a temper, and for a long time after she passed away, I just dismissed that, and I tried to forget about the temper that she had and the times when she would just fault me for any mistakes I made, and I held her on this pedestal. And part of what I had to do as sort of a writer in writing this book was really look at her as a multidimensional character, as someone who was beautiful but also flawed. And that was also important to me just in the earlier stages of my recovery to kind of recognize her in that way, because in recognizing her flaws, I could then more easily accept my own.
Yeah, thank you. So you are 11 when she dies?
Mm-hmm.
And then you spend much of your teenage years in treatment, 89 weeks. Tell us about that journey.
Yes, so initially my father knew that I needed care, but he wasn't sure how to find it. And just to contextualize this, this was in the late 1990s. And so he had taken me to my pediatrician, and the pediatrician told us essentially that my weight loss was a passing phase. And my father did not know what to make of that, tried to trust the doctor, but over the coming months, I proceeded to continue to fall deeper into what we would later learn was an eating disorder, and was continuing to lose weight. So 6 months later, he took me back to the doctor, who essentially said the same thing: she will grow out of this. I later learned that this is part of a larger systemic issue in which medical doctors get typically between 0 and 2 hours of training on eating disorders, which is really unsettling when you consider that nearly 30 million Americans will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lifetime. And so it wasn't until my father consulted a family friend who was a nurse who recommended that he take me to Boston Children's Hospital. And so my father took me, promptly made an appointment, and I was admitted that same day to the hospital and was given a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa. And it was the first time we actually had a word to describe what it was I was struggling with, because I thought that people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all. And I thought, well, I'm still eating a little bit, I mustn't have anorexia. And my father thought that the disorder only affected older people, because his only point of reference was the death of singer-songwriter Karen Carpenter, who had died due to complications from anorexia. And so this was eye-opening for us, right? And I was hospitalized at Boston Children's Hospital on 5 separate occasions, twice in the medical unit, 3 times in the psychiatric ward, because I was struggling both with the eating disorder, but also with a lot of comorbidities like severe obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety and depression. And so those treatments were very helpful. They stabilized me physically, and I often say that Boston Children's saved my life. I mean, that is not a sort of overstatement. I don't know where I would have been had I not gone there. But even though I would sometimes be on the psychiatric ward for 4 to 6 weeks at a time, it still wasn't enough time for me. And I still was in this revolving door of treatment. So my treatment team suggested that I get a higher level of care and that I do residential treatment. So I was in residential treatment for 1.5 years, which is almost unheard of these days. And I write in the book about how my public school system and the Department of Mental Health actually paid for my treatment, because there's no way that my father, as the director of housekeeping at a nursing home, would have been able to afford that level of care. So I was very fortunate in that sense. But it was really in residential treatment that I was able to begin working on recovery and begin grieving the loss of my mother's death, which was a big part of the recovery journey for me.
Yeah, and the care would have cost something like $90,000 a year. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so your recovery begins. At what point do you start to think about this the reality of the middle place?
Mm-hmm. It took a while for me to get there, because I mean, when I left treatment, I really felt like I had to achieve the gold standard of full recovery, and yet no one had ever really defined what that meant. And so in the absence of a definition, I equated it with a perfectionistic ideal. And I thought, well, if I want to be fully recovered, it means that I need to eat all of the right foods. I need to maintain just the right weight, whatever that means. I need to exercise just the right amount. I need to ace all of my classes, do all the extracurriculars. And so I was doing all of those things. I had returned to school my junior year and was really trying to excel in every way possible so that I could be the poster child for eating disorder recovery. Whereas before I wanted to identify as the girl with anorexia, now I wanted to be the girl who was fully recovered. And yet the pressure of that felt insurmountable. And at the same time, I had stopped going to therapy. I had been weaned off my medications. And I thought, well, I'm beyond that. I shouldn't need that anymore. And so I didn't believe that there was a space in between, right? I thought, well, you're either acutely sick or you're fully recovered. And that felt terrifying in some ways because I was afraid that if I faltered just once, I would fail and I would slide back into dangerous territory and end up sick again. And so in college, I did end up relapsing. I fell into this vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting and felt like I was failing at full recovery and failing at anorexia. And I didn't tell anyone. I continued to tell everyone that I was fully recovered, and I spoke about my eating disorder as something from the past. And for me, that felt very inauthentic because the narrative I was sharing with the world was very disconnected from the one that I was living out behind closed doors. And this continued even after college, right, when I was working at Pointer. We'll probably get into more of like what the middle place is, but I'd love to just read a passage that kind of speaks to this place that I was in right before I started to think through more of the middle place. Okay. All right, so this is on page 187 in case anyone wants to follow along, but it's from the chapter titled The Middle Place, and it is about me working at the Pointer Institute, which is where I first met Stephen. And I remember talking about my eating disorder as something from the past, right? And so this is kind of from that time period. So I wrote, I became a vegetarian, finding it was a way for me to restrict food under the guise of a healthy diet. I wish I had your discipline, friends would say when I ordered a salad for lunch, not knowing I had inhaled thousands of calories the night before. During a work retreat one year, a colleague asked if I wanted some candy. He handed me a bowl of Hershey's Kisses, but before I could answer or grab one, another colleague interjected. Oh, Mallory would never eat those, she said, as though surprised anyone even offered. I wanted the candy, but my eating disorder dismantled my desire, reminding me I had a reputation to uphold. Oh, no thanks, I said politely, pushing the bowl away. At Publix, the grocery store that evening, I bought a bag of Hershey Kisses. Alone in my apartment, I inhaled every single one. I'd gotten so good at carving out a fake identity, outwardly free from my eating disorder, but inwardly trapped by it. And I couldn't help but feel like a fraud. It seemed as though I was no longer battling my disorder, but rather my recovery from it. I began to wonder if other people were hiding their hurts behind the shield of their stories. As a journalist, I turned to media for answers. I was well aware of ways that the media, books, newspapers, magazines, television, and social media, perpetuate an ideal of thinness, portraying the body as a problem to be fixed. The media have lauded fad diets and fit bodies for decades, and every era has had its phases and crazes. I grew up in the 1990s when the heroin chic aesthetic was in vogue. Models like Kate Moss popularized the look, emaciated bodies, pale skin, and wreaths of exhaustion circling the eyes. The early 2000s saw the rise of thinspiration content online. Pro-Ana, pro-anorexia, and pro-Mia, pro-bulimia groups on forums, Tumblr, and YouTube glamorized these illnesses, with members who shared tips and encouraged one another's eating disorder thoughts and behaviors. I was aware of these toxic groups at the time and saw occasional news coverage about them. I sometimes Googled them myself, usually after bouts of binging that left me feeling ashamed and alone. Maybe if I just take a quick look, I would think, these sites could inspire me to stop binging. I peeked but never posted. Still today, pro-Ana and pro-Mia content persists on social media, despite a growing awareness of how harmful it is. In truth, I was desperate to find stories about other people who were grappling with the ups and downs of recovery. I consumed news from a wide range of sources and knew where to turn for quality journalism, but I couldn't find in-depth stories about recovery from eating disorders. News and feature stories were few and far between, and the ones I found did not match my lived experience. They described people who had struggled with eating disorders and were now fully recovered. The stories had beginnings and ends, but they were missing middles, the setbacks and small victories that lie between the origins of a disorder and one's recovery from it. Recovery was often confined to one or two sentences marked by triumphant words: overcame, achieved, conquered. I saw my false narrative reflected in these stories, the one where I pretended to be all better. But I didn't see my actual narrative, and that lack of a mirrored image left me feeling deeply misunderstood. I began to think that eating disorder recovery was an untold, or at best half-told, story. So it was shortly after that that I began to work in restorative narratives, which we could talk more about, and that really led to this idea of the middle place.
What's a restorative narrative?
Funny that you ask. No, it's so essentially not long after I was at this place in sort of my recovery, even though wasn't really recovery, I was really still struggling. I began working for a small media nonprofit, and I was tasked with helping journalists to tell restorative narratives. And it was this genre that we were developing. And essentially it was giving a name to stories that look at how people in communities make meaningful progress forward in the aftermath of illness or trauma or tragedy. Because so often in journalism, we tell the story about the trauma or tragedy, and then we move on to the next story. And maybe we tell a one-year anniversary story, but we don't look at how people kind of just move through the messy middles and how they find these quiet moments of resilience and hope. So I was training journalists on how to tell these stories, and at some point it occurred to me that this could be a really helpful framework for thinking about my own story, right? And thinking about, could I embrace this messy middle and be more honest about it?
Yeah. I want to go back. I want to pick out a couple of things about the messy middle. Mm-hmm. At several points in the book, you talk about how you thought of anorexia as your best friend. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I did think of anorexia as a best friend, right? And that was a common sentiment that I heard from other people who I talked to for the book. And eventually I came to see it as a foe. But part of the sort of friendship for me was this idea that in the immediate aftermath of my mother's death, I really needed love and care and attention. And I had a very loving father. But because I seemed like I was okay, and because I wasn't crying, and I went to school and read the eulogy at my mom's funeral without crying, everyone thought that I was strong and resilient, and they praised me for it, right? They thought Mallory's doing an incredibly great job in the aftermath of this horrific loss. And it wasn't until I got sick with anorexia that my body spoke for me, and that people began to realize, oh, Mallary needs care and attention. And so for me, I thought, well, the eating disorder served that purpose. Finally, it's giving me that attention that I needed and wanted. And when I ended up in the hospital, for a brief time, I did feel closer to my mother, because my most accessible memories of my mother were of her in the hospital when she was sick with cancer. And so the hospital was very familiar territory to me. And when she died, I lost that support and that community, right, of nurses and doctors who knew me. And it just felt like, oh, I don't have my mom anymore. I don't have that community anymore. And so when I was in the hospital, though I was in a different hospital, once again, I felt like, oh, I'm in sort of this place where now I'm being cared for. And so the eating disorder in that way made me feel special. It made me feel worthy of attention and care. But the sicker I got, the farther away I felt from my mother, and the more out of control I felt, right? Because initially I thought, well, I couldn't control what happened in my mom's body, but I can control what I put into mine. But that's the irony of eating disorders, is that we think that they're a friend, but then they end up completely stripping us of our life, right? And of all of our joys and pleasures.
Yeah, thank you. So let's go back to the middle place. Is this where you start to think about slips? And what's a slip?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked. Yes, the middle place is really this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And for the longest time, I thought that I had to be fully recovered before I could write this book. I've been writing iterations of this book since I was 17. I kid you not, right? And I'm glad those earlier iterations never saw the light of day, because they were not super well written, but they were all stepping stones to this eventual book. But so many of the books that I read on eating disorders were written from the perspective of people who are fully recovered. And those narratives are important, right? And I interview people for the book who are fully recovered, so I don't want to discredit that. But when those are the only narratives that we hear, it can really silence those of us who are in this middle place, who don't see our own lived experience reflected in literature or in inspirational talks. And I was, as a writer, really keen on trying to explore these questions of what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to move through life knowing that your disorder remains a vulnerability? And so those were questions I wanted to explore through the lens of the middle place, which is where I see myself as a woman in recovery. The middle place is not quasi or pseudo recovery, which are terms that are often used in the eating disorder field to describe people who are not really fully recovered, right? I think those terms can be pernicious because they can make people feel like their recovery is not real or they're somehow faking it. The middle place is really rooted in this idea that recovery is possible, and yet slips can happen, right? And they don't just happen in the first week or two after treatment, if one even does receive treatment. They can happen in an ongoing way, which has been the case for me. And the middle place is not about settling for stagnancy. It's always about trying to move forward, right? Trying to progress, but also giving ourselves grace when we slip. Because for the longest time, whenever I would slip, I would just think, oh, that is so horrible, right? And I would not tell anyone about my slips, and every slip would turn into a slide. So I was constantly slipping and sliding to the point where I relapsed. And now when I think about the middle place, it's really about removing that stigma and shame around slips and recognizing that that very word slip actually suggests some sort of movement, right? Because you can't slip if you're standing still. And often we slip when we're trying to make really hard choices in service of recovery. And so now when I slip, and I still do, even though I'm very far along in the middle place, instead of keeping those slips silent, I talk to my husband or my therapist about them. And I ask myself, how do I get back up now? Not tomorrow, not next week once I'm past my deadlines, but how do I get back up now? And so I think there's a lot of strength in being able to recognize a slip. And when I was telling a clinician 2 years ago about the title of the book, she said, I wouldn't title it slip, right? And she was very well-intentioned, but she said, that word has a really negative connotation in our field. And I said, well, that's precisely the point, right? We want to try to remove the stigma around this. So I see the middle place as being a space that is hopeful. It is rooted in the strength-based idea that recovery is possible, but imperfect. But I will say that it is not an easy place to be, partly because there is a lot of stigma and shame still associated with it. And it can be hard sometimes to ask for help in this place. And that's a big part of why I want to give a name to it, so that people can say, I'm in this middle place, right? And I need support. Here's the kind of support that I need to be able to move through this place. Knowing that maybe eventually they will get to a place where they're fully recovered, right? I mean, I would love that for myself one day, but I'm not there, and that's for no lack of trying, right? So I think we need to recognize that these eating disorders can very often remain a vulnerability, but it doesn't mean that we can't live a full life. Right?
So Mallory, you did a survey for this book that went out to 700 folks, 724 people. You interviewed 175 folks. Tell us how those interviews, what did you learn from those interviews?
Yes, I will say too, I'm so impressed by just how well you remember numbers. You remembered 89 weeks in treatment, $90,000, all of those numbers are so exact with the survey respondents and interviews, so thank you, it's a good journalist.
I read the book twice.
Yes, he was one of my early readers, so he got to be one of the first to read it, so. Thank you for the close reads. But yes, I really wanted to interview a lot of people for this book and survey people for this book because in many ways I fit the stereotype of someone with an eating disorder, right? I identify as female, I live in a smaller body, I'm white, I'm middle to upper class, and so I recognize that yes, I could speak from lived experience, but I could only really speak from my story alone, and I really wanted other people to see themselves reflected in this book. And so I decided to launch a survey that ultimately reached the 724 people from 44 states and 37 countries around the world. Everyone who responded had lived experience with an eating disorder. And I, having struggled with anorexia, also wanted to be able to write about different types of eating disorders. So the survey was really helpful in terms of finding folks who had struggled with bulimia and OSFED and ARFID and binge eating disorder. And then I really wanted to do interviews, right? Because as a journalist, that was important to me. So I did interview 175 of those survey respondents, as well as clinicians and researchers, many of whom are here tonight, which is so special. But those interviews really broadened my scope of understanding, because I thought naively that I was an expert on eating disorders, having lived experience with one. And there was some truth to that, but there was so much that I didn't know in terms of just all of the research that has come out about the neurobiology of eating disorders and the genetic components, and research about the intersection between temperament traits and eating disorders, and looking just at the evolution of care and what clinicians have learned since the late 90s when I was treated. So that was super important to me, and I hope that it makes it a richer book, because it really is this true blend of personal narrative, reportage, and research.
Yeah, I learned a ton from the book, and one of the things that really surprised me was the impact of eating disorders on the brain. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's to the point where some scientists refer to eating disorders as brain disorders, because there are neurobiological changes that happen when one is struggling with an eating disorder. So I talked with a lot of folks who are studying this and interviewed them in the book. And there was a lot of research that really helped me to empathize with my younger self in the process of writing this book, because certainly in the late 90s, early 2000s, we really didn't know much of anything about how the eating disorders affected the brain. And so this research wasn't at our disposal. But in talking with the researchers behind it, there were certain points that fascinated me. One researcher I talked to, for instance, spoke about how when children, adolescents are developing a sense of identity, there are connections that are formed in the brain, and those connections rely on white matter. And white matter is made up of myelin, and the production of myelin in part relies on dietary fat consumption. And so starvation then significantly alters the production of that myelin and can lead to altered neurodevelopment and a distorted sense of identity. And I thought that makes so much sense as to why I felt so tethered to the disorder and why I identified with it so deeply. There was no way that I would have known sort of what was happening within the brain during that time. But in learning that research, for instance, it just helped me to understand my 13-year-old self at a much deeper level. So I was really intrigued by the ways in which all of this neurobiological research is helping us to just more collectively understand why it is so hard to often get out of these disorders, and why many people struggling get stuck in these cognitive ruts.
Did you read every study yourself that's mentioned in the book?
So I don't know that I read every single study. There are 10,000 words of endnotes in the book, but I printed out a lot of studies, which is not very environmentally friendly, but I have just these stacks upon stacks of research. So I would say I read the vast majority of the studies that were in here. And I was especially just interested in ones that posed something new or different or created some element of surprise. And so I would read the research, and then I would figure out who I wanted to interview, right? Especially when there was research that I found really compelling, I would reach out to the researchers and ask them to talk about more of their work. And I attended conferences too. I was fortunate enough to get a grant while I was working on this book that paid for my travel to go to a lot of eating disorder conferences where I met clinicians, I met researchers, and I would try to set up interviews there. And that was also a way to really learn more about just care for eating disorders and how that's changed over time, but also it was a great way to just be exposed to the latest research on eating disorders.
Yeah. You spend a fair bit of time explaining that just the word recovery is has multiple meanings in the context of eating disorders. Can you say more about that?
Yes. So I just was intrigued myself as to what does full recovery actually mean? Because as I mentioned, when I left treatment, no one ever really defined it for me. And as I started looking at the research, I was struck by the fact that there are so many different definitions of what full recovery actually means, which makes it really hard to compare data across studies. If you look at the percentages of people who fully recover in research, the percentages are so wide-ranging as to almost be comical. And this is not to discredit the work of researchers, but just to say that we are lacking a consensus definition of what full recovery actually means, because in some studies, it is based on BMI, and even sort of the BMI kind of measures are different from study to study. Cessation of eating disorder behaviors can be part of it, but the duration of time of that cessation varies from study to study. There are some studies that look at the cognitive aspects, which I think is really important, but not all studies look at that. And we know that sort of ruminations and the lingering cognitive effects can often be the hardest part to shake from an eating disorder. And so it was really interesting because I thought about this fact that we are trying to sort of push for full recovery, and yet as a field, we haven't really defined what that actually means. And so part of this, I think, also comes down to the reality that it's on us to feel empowered to define recovery for ourselves. I think that's really important. And every time I would interview someone for the book, I would always ask, how do you want me to refer to where you're at with your illness or your recovery? Because I never wanted to make assumptions that just because someone seemed like they were better, that they were fully recovered, right? And I think that's really important to just honor the language that we each use. I say that I'm in recovery, and that feels more appropriate to me than saying that I'm recovered, right, or fully recovered. But I think that we need to consider the fact that there are other ways of describing recovery, right? And full recovery can be possible for some, but we need to get clarity on what that actually means, right? So that we can describe it better to folks, but also so that we can think about just widening our vocabulary around recovery. And I think that widening of vocabulary can ultimately lead to more inclusivity when it comes to talking about recovery. That's a big part of why I want to just give words to the middle place, because I think that that is an important term for us to adopt as we think about recovery and the different stages of recovery. If we only think about recovery in more rigid and black and white terms, then in some ways we're perpetuating the very harmful aspects of eating disorders, right? Because so often when people are sick with eating disorders, they have very rigid thinking, very black and white thinking that can keep them stuck. And so it's important for us to embrace gray spaces from a clinical standpoint, but also from a lived experience standpoint. And as a writer, I'm very interested in nuance and gray space and untidy narratives, if you will.
Yeah. So when you were interviewing folks, how did you get them to be honest about their experiences? Because these are regular people. You're a journalist. Mm-hmm. How'd you get them to be honest and open with you?
Yeah. So, I mean, it felt like a real honor to talk with so many people about their eating disorders, because in many cases, people were opening up to me and sharing their stories and pouring their hearts out to me, and they didn't know me, right? And so I would always just tell people in an email what I wanted to get out of the interview, why I wanted to interview them. And the vast majority of people who I interviewed with lived experience were survey respondents who had indicated in the survey that they were willing to be interviewed. And so I, at the beginning of the interviews, would share just a little bit about my own lived experience, just to let them know that I could understand from a certain standpoint. And then I would let them know if there's any questions that you don't want to answer, please let me know, and I will respect that. Right? And I wanted to just sort of lay out that sort of framework from the beginning. And I would usually start with kind of softball questions, some easier questions, before I sort of dove right into the questions around, well, how did your eating disorder develop, right? So I would try to ease into the conversation and then continue to ask follow-up questions, because sometimes there are moments where people maybe just would skirt over something, and as someone who really wanted to delve into the messy middle, I would often ask, well, what did that look like, right? Because sometimes people would jump from sort of the sickness to recovery, right? And they wouldn't really describe how they got to where they are. And I would always sort of be mindful of that and always go back and ask, what were some meaningful pivots, right, that led to the development of your recovery or helped you progress, right? I think sometimes we have a tendency to say, well, what was the big turning point, right? And for a lot of us, there was not one big turning point. It was this sort of accumulation of slow steps and meaningful pivots. So I would talk about that. And also at times there were moments when people would get really emotional, or I would ask a question and they would just be silent. And just collectively, societally, we have a tendency to interject because silence is awkward, it's uncomfortable. But as a journalist, I really learned to just sit with that silence and to be okay with it, because a lot of times people would need that silence just to gain their composure, or they would need that silence to cry, right? Or to think about what they wanted to say. And so I would often say, just, it's okay, take the time that you need, right? This happened, for instance, in one occasion when I was interviewing the mother of a daughter who had died due to complications from anorexia. And I had been in treatment with this woman's daughter. I had wanted to reconnect with her when I was writing the book. And when I tried Googling her, I'd seen an obituary, and I was devastated by that, right? And I thought, I want to include her in the book. I want to honor her memory. And this was the case with two of the girls I was in treatment with. And so I ended up finding their parents' addresses, and I mailed them letters, and I interviewed the families, right? And I was talking with the mother of one of the girls, who's named Tracy, and she was just crying, right? She was breaking down and crying. And so I just sort of sat there with her in that sadness. And then I asked if she had any photos that she wanted to show me of Tracy, because sometimes when you can look at a photo with someone, it takes the pressure off of having to maintain that eye contact and of having to just feel like you're constantly answering questions, and it can open up new avenues for storytelling. So there we were on a Zoom call, right, because we were far away from each other. But she was holding up these pictures, and I was saying, tell me about that, right? Or what was that memory that you shared with her? And that helped me to then see Tracy as a person beyond her disorder. So I try to do things like that would really open up avenues for storytelling, but also help build trust so that people knew that I genuinely cared about their stories.
Yeah. I'm going to ask just a couple more questions, and then we'll turn to you all, okay? You have small children. Do they know your story? They know you were writing a book. How much do they know about your story?
Yeah, so I do have small children. So I have an 8-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. And it's interesting because in the final chapter of my book, in the epilogue, I talk about how my children didn't know about the actual content of my book. They believed that my book was about my mom. And to an extent, they were right? Because I used to say, well, what do you think Mom's book is about? And they would say, oh, it's about your mom and about losing your mom. I said, yeah, that's right. And I had turned in my manuscript in June of 2024, so just to give you kind of a sense of time. And so when I turned it in, they really didn't know what it was about. My daughter actually drew a picture of what she hoped would be the cover of the book. And while it wasn't the cover, I did ask the publisher to put it in the back of the book. So if you flip to the end of the epilogue, you'll see it. It's really sweet. And it is a picture of me and my mom. And it was taken from a photo that I have on my desk of me and my mom. And so it's this really beautiful interpretation of what my daughter believed the book was about. And now that the book is out in the world, I remember before it came out last month, I thought, I really want to tell my kids a little bit more about what Slip is about before the rest of the world reads this book. It just felt like I wanted to share more with them. And so I'm working on an essay about this because, of course, like the writer in me always wants to write about these things. But I tried to find ways that were developmentally appropriate to tell my kids about my story. And so I said, the book is about my mom and losing my mom, but it's also about how I got really sick after my mom died, and I didn't take care of my body, and I ended up having to go to the hospital, and I had to get help for many years, and got help, but then got a little sick again, and I've had to really work hard at my recovery, and I've had to work hard on taking care of my body and accepting my body, and asking for help when I need it. And there are some times when I slip, but then I get back up again. And so just sort of painting these broad strokes so that they have a little bit of a better understanding of what the book's about. And as they get older, I will continue to tell them more. They certainly have heard me talking about just diet culture, and I try to teach them about that so that they can actually learn what it is and learn not to internalize it. And I talk with them about how all bodies are worthy of respect, no matter how big or small, short or tall. And we have lots of conversations about those things. So I think at some point they'll be able to start connecting all of the dots. And I hope they will one day read this book. But my daughter, before I left on one of my tour trips a few weeks ago, she had made this bracelet for me that said slip. And she said, "Here, Mommy," she said, "I want you to have this." She said, "Sometimes we slip, but then we get back up again." I thought, okay, she and my son too, I think, are catching on to the message that I'm really trying to share with this book.
That is darling. Thank you. While you were writing the book, did you slip?
Such a good question. I appreciate that. And I was very mindful of that. I made a very conscious decision to go back to therapy when I started writing this book because I knew that it was going to be challenging. I actually decided to go back to therapy and also to see a dietitian just for preventive measures to really make sure that I had a support system. And years ago, I would have been ashamed to say that, right? Because there were so many years where I thought, oh, I'm supposed to be past that. But now I embrace that, right? Just as someone who wants to continue to move forward and make progress. So that was important to me. But I remember I was writing the chapter about my college relapse, and I was writing about the first night that I ever binge ate. And I was in the midst of writing this, and I could feel anxious sort of writing about it. And I found myself in the midst of a binge as I was writing this, right? I was eating large amounts of food by myself uncontrollably. And then I thought, oh no, right? Like this is not good, because I, in the book, was writing about how often in college when I was writing essays and papers for college, I would often binge eat, right? Because I felt like I needed to be perfect at my writing. I felt like I had lost my mom. I felt like I'd lost my disorder when I was beginning to recover, and I didn't want to lose my identity as a writer. So I put this immense pressure on myself to do really well so I could still identify as a writer. But then here I was writing this book and binge eating. So I said, okay, I don't want that to happen again, right? So I told my husband about it, kind of told my therapist about it. And I found that there were other moments where I felt tempted to restrict. For instance, when I was writing about kind of severe food restriction and the days when I was acutely sick with anorexia. And I had to remind myself, as both a woman in recovery and as a writer, that we don't have to sort of re-inhabit ourselves in a way that is counterproductive to our recovery. Because sometimes there were moments where I would think, oh, I could write about this more viscerally or in this more even authentic way if I were to just sort of re-engage in those behaviors, right? But I did not want to do that. I knew that could be a slippery slope. So instead, I found other ways to re-inhabit my younger self. I looked at my old journals that I had kept. I had 32 journals from when I was really acutely sick and in the early stages of my recovery. So I looked through those, right? Those were not easy to look through, but they didn't result in me re-engaging in behaviors. I looked at my old medical records. I talked with my former medical providers. I did interviews with my father and other family members. So those were ways that I felt like I could authentically revisit the past. And I did a lot of revisitations too, like revisiting my childhood home and hospitals. And that was part of how I did that, so that I could prevent myself from having these slips during the writing process.
Okay, last question. What's the one thing you want readers to take from this book?
Oh my gosh, okay. So there's so many takeaways, but I want people to recognize that slips are not failures. I feel like that's so much at the heart of this book, that just because you've slipped, it's not grounds for failure. It can actually be an opportunity for growth. And so my hope is that people will read this book and recognize that slips are a normal part of the process, and not stigmatize them and not stay silent about them, because when we're silent, that is what keeps us stuck. It's what keeps us sick. If we can talk about slips and if we feel like we are in an environment where that kind of conversation can happen, then we can really find ways to get up from those slips and to use those slips as a learning moment that can help us to move forward in the middle place.
It's a very hopeful book. All right, good people. Who has a question? The person in the gentleman in the very back. And
yes,
then,
can you talk about how your relationship with your husband, as well as having children, either helped or harmed your recovery process?
Yes, thank you for asking that. So I do have a chapter in the book, chapter 10, that looks at love, sex, and relationships. I partly wanted to write about that because it's not something that I see written about very much within the context of eating disorders. And also for me, having a relationship was really important. I wrote about sort of just dating different guys and always feeling really uncomfortable in my body and thinking I had to love myself before I could love someone else, but then realizing that I wasn't necessarily always going to love my body, right? And so that couldn't be this barrier to entry to being in a relationship. And I also really wanted to be in a relationship because having lost my mom when I was so little, I did not want to just have a flame, right? I wanted a relationship and a commitment because I was always afraid of loss, right? Losing relationships. And so when I first met Troy, the man who I went on to marry, I was really nervous about sharing my eating disorder story with him. But from our very first date, I felt incredibly close to him. And it was unlike any other person who I had dated. On our first date, he told me that his father had died in a motorcycle accident when he was 14. And then I told him about my mother. And he was just such a gentleman. He was so vulnerable with his own story, and it made me feel like I could be open and vulnerable with him. So after probably maybe 2 or 3 months, I told him about my own experiences with an eating disorder. It was probably even sooner than that. And I thought that it would push him away, right? I thought, oh my gosh, he is just going to run for the hills. He's going to be sort of freaked out by the fact that I have had this lived experience and that I'm not over this disorder yet. But he actually really talked about how he loved how strong I was. He thought that my vulnerability was one of my greatest strengths. And he said, I want to help you through this. And so in many ways, being honest with him was what helped to draw us closer to each other. And so certainly just being in a relationship with him didn't make my eating disorder go away, but it did help me to make meaningful progress because fortuitously, as I was beginning to develop this thinking around the middle place, that was when I met him. And so I was then able to have someone who I could talk to about the slips. And I didn't tell him about every single slip, right? I mean, there were moments that I felt like it was still too hard to do that. But suddenly I had someone who I could talk to about the slips. And it was harder to be secretive about my behaviors because I was spending so much more time with him, right? And I was learning to feel more comfortable in my own body, right? I talked about just the ways in which he was just loving, right? And he treated my body with respect, and it helped me to then in turn figure out how I could accept my own body more. I mean, still today, he tells me every day that I'm beautiful, and I mean, it might sound cheesy, but like, it's really special to have found that, right? And I never thought I could find that in a relationship, but he continues to be the person who I talk to about my slips. And I will just say too, that for a long time, I thought once I became a mom that I would get rid of my eating disorder once and for all. I thought that there would be these two beautiful bookends to my story where I thought, well, I developed my eating disorder when my mom died. And then once I become a mom, then I will get rid of the disorder. But that turned out to be too premature of an ending and too tidy of an ending. And so I certainly when I was pregnant, that was a really beautiful time and I really took care of my body. But then I write in the book about how I did struggle postpartum, right? And struggled in unanticipated ways, particularly around obsessively pumping breast milk. So I write about that in the book, not for it to be a trigger, but really to create awareness around that, because I think there's so many moments in our lives where we could potentially be at risk of relapse or of slippage, and we may not even be aware of it, right? And there was so little research done on just this sort of postpartum period and this risk of kind of OCD behaviors around pumping. So I really wanted to speak truth to that. But lastly, I'll just say being a mom has helped me grow and progress also in ways that I never anticipated. So it's been a really beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You spoke about sort of the guardrails you put on yourself as you went to write this. Is there anything in the process of writing that has helped you or surprised you in a good way about your recovery?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, in this book, it's the first time that I've really delved deeply into the middle place, and the first time that I've really just owned the fact that I'm in the middle place, right? I would sort of touch upon it here and there, sprinkle it into little essays I was writing, but I really felt like I wanted this to be the most truthful version of my story possible. And it was hard to write this from the perspective of someone who is not over their disorder, right? Because I wondered, well, how are my colleagues going to react to this? Or what will other people in the field think? Will they think that I'm saying that recovery is not possible, right? And so it just had all these different questions running through my mind. But then as I wrote this, I was beginning to recognize that naming the middle place and being honest about where I'm at in my recovery is actually an act of courage, right? And I don't say that lightly, but I think it's true, especially in a society that really prefers stories with protagonists who prevail and who triumph over their disorders. And so I really began to see my story through a more thoughtful lens. And in writing this and naming the middle place, it's actually helped me to give myself more grace when I slip, and to just recognize that those slips are maybe still going to happen. Maybe they always will happen, but I'm now at a place where I can ask for help when they do. And this book has made me even more conscious of how I need to do that, right? Because I don't want to be hypocritical in terms of telling other people, oh, well, you should ask for help when you slip, and then I don't ask for help, right? So I've made an even more concerted effort to ask for help in those moments. And that has really helped me grow.
Other good questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this. Very excited to read the book. Yes. Just curious, like looking back, at this whole process, I guess, what would you say to your younger self, like going through those different moments when the eating disorder started, when you were in that sort of middle place? Like, what would you say to yourself?
Yes. Oh, that's such a lovely question. So, I mean, one thing that I would say to my younger self is that, one, it's okay to cry, right? It's okay to let out those emotions, because crying does not equal weakness, right? Oftentimes, it's when we can share those feelings that we are actually showing strength. And I would also say that it's really important to embrace hard truths and not sugarcoat those hard truths, because I think a lot of times those harder truths are our best armor, right? I mean, my family tried to protect me by shielding me from hard truths, when in fact, the reverse probably would have been more helpful, right? If they had been honest about my mom's sickness, about the fact that she was going to die. Looking back at my medical records, that was very clear, right? That she was going to pass. So I wish that I had known that at the time. And I wish I could go back and tell my younger self, you are special apart from anorexia, right? And I wish I could have reminded myself of all the ways that I was special, that I was worthy of care and love, and that the eating disorder did not need to be in my life in order for me to be worthy of that care.
Mallary, do you cry more often now?
Oh, I do. Yeah. I mean, when I'm not falling asleep while my husband and I are watching TV, I'm often crying if it's a sad movie, especially if it's any sort of movie about mothers and daughters or about death. Certainly makes me cry. And yeah, I mean, I'm a lot more open than I was years ago with my emotions.
Yes. Yes, please.
So, thank you so much, Mallary. Yes, it's just lovely. I should say I haven't finished it completely yet, so I'm going to ask you a question that you talk about. But I'm really glad you're talking about the middle place. You're right, there isn't a lot of conversation about that. It's a very real place for very many people. I can't remember if you said something about how in the middle place still trying to make progress, which doesn't mean it's not okay to be in the middle place. But I'm wondering if that's true, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in many ways, the middle place is a spectrum. So it's not necessarily just this very temporary space that people are in. I mean, in some cases it can be. I think everyone is in this middle place at some point, right? But I mean, for me, I see myself as really living in this middle place, and the more I've lived in it, the less sandwiched I feel in between these extremes of acute sickness and full recovery. I feel like I have a lot of room to roam and a lot of room to grow in this middle place. And so when I think about progress, I mean, for me, it's sometimes even just trying different foods still, right? Like, okay, thinking about, all right, there's, you know, a food at a restaurant that I haven't had in years, or a food that may seem like somewhat still of a fear food, right? But I'm gonna try this, right? I'm at a dinner date with my husband, I'm gonna try this food and just go for it, right? And so that, for instance, is a sign of progress, right? When I can sort of make those choices. Or in these moments when we go to a restaurant and I see that there's calories all over the menu, and I think, okay, well, the eating disorder self is going to say you need to pick the lowest calorie item on the menu. But instead, for me, progress has been, here, Troy, can you read off the menu items to me so I don't have to look at the calories, right? And being able to ask for that help. I mean, those are two examples that have just happened even more recently, right? Because I was recognizing that I was making choices based on calorie amount. So I said, I don't want that to be the case. I want to continue to make progress. How can I do that, right? I can ask for help in those moments. And so I'm always trying to kind of think through that, right? Or thinking about, okay, well, I've gotten used to kind of buying, you know, lower calorie bread. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to just buy the regular slice of bread, right? And like making these very conscious decisions, sometimes in advance of when I have to make them, but also sometimes like when I'm in the grocery store aisle, right? And just saying, I'm getting the regular bread and that's what I'm going to eat this week. So it differs sometimes, like month to month, right? But I'm always asking myself, how do I counteract the disordered thoughts, which are still there, right? Even though I'm always working on recovery, they've never quite gone away for me. And so for me, it's a matter of challenging those thoughts and always asking, how can I make choices in service of more recovery, with hopes that day by day, more recovery will lead to a fuller expression of it.
Mallory, when was the last time you tried a new food, and what was it?
Oh gosh. Oh my goodness. Good question. So I'm trying to think of what the most recent thing was. No. Oh, you've stumped me. Oh, well, I guess it was, so we were at a sushi restaurant and there was this vegetarian sushi that was kind of, it had like tuna, and it was basically like a soy tuna, right? And I usually, when I get the vegetarian sushi, will just get the tempura and just get kind of the veggie based one. But I thought, oh, like, I'm gonna just try to get this one and see what it's like, right? And I got it and I liked it, right? That was me trying something new. It was also me trying to inch closer toward another goal I have in the middle place, which is to consider maybe not being such a strict vegetarian, right? Because I think it still is me holding on a bit to the eating disorder, right? I'm always trying to sort of be honest about that and think through that. And so I've thought at some point, right, maybe I can start eating more meat, right? Maybe I can still be mostly vegetarian, but just be less rigid about that. And so that was like a baby step toward that, right? So sometimes it's a little bit of harm reduction, but a little bit of that sort of idea of baby steps with hopes that they'll lead to more of a leap in the middle place.
Yeah, full progress.
Yeah.
Who else? Anybody else? Yes.
You know, you talk about having experience in treatment from the 90s until now. You talk about interviewing 175 clinicians and what you would like readers to take away from the book. What would you like clinicians to take away from your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would love for clinicians to just have more open and honest conversations about slips. And I think that, I mean, treatment has evolved to the point where there is more of that, I would say. I mean, now we have relapse prevention programs, which we didn't have previously. Some treatment programs have those, and I think that that's good. But I think really being able to talk about the possibilities of slips and to name this middle place is important, not to sort of dismantle hope that full recovery is possible, but just to recognize that a lot of times when people leave treatment, that's when the hard work really begins, right? And that's where people are really in the early stages of this middle place, and we need to be able to set realistic expectations about what that looks like, and to really encourage them to not stay silent about slips, but to talk about them and to recognize that these slips may keep happening, right? Because I remember when I left treatment, I thought, well, I mean, within a couple of weeks, I should be okay, right? And no, that wasn't the case. And so to just speak truth to that is really important, to not stigmatize it and to not talk about this place as quasi or pseudo recovery. I would love for us to just kind of get rid of those terms because I don't think that they're particularly helpful. And so that for me would be really important, to just be able to have more conversations around this and to welcome more inclusive conversations about what recovery looks like, rather than telling everyone, and I'm not suggesting that you do this or that all clinicians do this, but that, rather than just saying sort of it's either full recovery or you're somehow failing or not quite, meeting the standards. So yeah, my hope is that this book will help clinicians to think about how they can talk about recovery in more expansive ways.
Yes.
So do you actually think, building on that, do you actually think that your book and/or this idea of a middle place in slips has implications for other people in recovery from other diseases?
Yes, I definitely do. I mean, it's interesting because I wrote a Wall Street Journal essay a couple of weeks ago about the middle place, and that piece spurred more comments from readers than any other essay I've published. And
Can we find that?
Yes, yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Yeah, if you search just Wall Street Journal and my name, it will pop up. And yeah, I mean, so many of the people who reached out to me were folks who were struggling with addiction, right? Or who were in recovery from addiction. So a lot of people who had been addicted to substances said, yes, I mean, I am in this middle place, or this middle place is very relatable to me. Similarly, I heard from people with autoimmune disorders, right, who don't necessarily see kind of a finish line to a chronic disease, but who see themselves as being in this middle place, but they never had a name for it. I think about it as an apt term too for grief and loss, right? Because even though my mom has been dead now for almost 30 years, I still carry the load of that loss, right? And that load is much lighter than it once was, but it's still there. I haven't arrived at a place of closure, just as I haven't arrived at a place of full recovery. I find that I'm in the middle place with that grief and that loss. So I do think that it is very applicable to a lot of different ways of thinking about recovery and mental health.
And you get the last question.
Right. I was wondering what's the strongest motivator in your recovery and whether that's changed over time.
It has changed over time. I mean, certainly for me, I loved just thinking about trying to be better for my husband initially. I mean, that was very helpful, being in a relationship. And first and foremost, you want to get better for yourself, right? I mean, I remember family used to say, like my dad would say, just eat the meal, Mal, do it for me, right? And I would often think, well, I don't want to do it for you, even though I loved him, right? Because I was so sick that I didn't want to do it for anyone, right? I didn't want recovery for myself or for anyone. And then as I began to recover more, I wanted it for myself. I wanted it for my family, like my father. And then once I met my husband, I wanted it for him and our relationship. And now I still want it for that, but I really want it for my kids, because I know there is a genetic component to eating disorders, which I write about in the last chapter of the book. And so I can't control possible genetic risks, but I can have some sort of control over the environment that I create for my kids at home. And so it's really important for me to think about the example that I want to set for my kids, and to help them to think about how they can accept their bodies. I don't expect them to unconditionally love their bodies, because in many ways that feels unrealistic in our society, that's just so steeped in fat phobia. But I want them to think about how they can take up space and how they can look at their bodies as these sort of instruments rather than ornaments, right? How they can think about the ways in which their bodies enable them to play and move through this world. For my daughter's 9th birthday, I made this mirror for her, and I kind of, it was in the shape of a flower, and I painted all of these words on the petals that described who she was, right, or who she is. So caring, loving, kind, creative, empathetic, so that when she looks in the mirror, she can see not just what she looks like, but who she is. And I want that for both my son and my daughter. A lot of times people will ask me, oh, well, you must really like worry about your daughter one day getting an eating disorder. And I think I worry about it for both my kids, right? Because boys also struggle with eating disorders, men struggle, transgendered individuals struggle. We have to recognize that. And so I think about this a lot for both of my kids. And every time that I make a choice in service of recovery, I'm also making it in hopes that they will never have to deal with this disorder, right? And so that for me is one of the biggest motivators in my recovery.
Wonderful questions. Thank you. Can we give it up for Mallary Tenore Tarpley?
Thank you all for
Thanks for coming tonight, everybody.
Yes. If you have a copy that I haven't signed, I'm happy to sign it for you.